The sudden, sharp irritation you feel when watching someone fail publicly is not your independent judgment. It is the precise moment private exhaustion transforms into a quiet, desperate need to see them collapse completely. This mechanism forms the bedrock of Jungian analysis, revealing how the objective psyche redirects inner friction outward. What you call righteous anger is actually an engineered shield protecting you from your own unexamined shadow. When a community, a workplace, or an entire digital collective begins to fracture under the weight of its own unacknowledged anxiety, it coordinates an unsettling phenomenon within the shared human consciousness. The collective does not seek to repair its internal structural flaws. Rather, it unconsciously selects an individual to serve as a living container for its accumulated psychological waste. This process goes far beyond simple scapegoating or modern cancellation dynamics. It represents a sophisticated coordination of the unconscious mind, where a group systematically engineers a single target to bear the cross of their collective failures, preserving their own fragile persona at all costs. By focusing all ambient hostility onto a single point, the crowd experiences a false sense of purification, mistake-free alignment, and sudden, artificial peace. This mechanism operates in the immediate texture of daily social interactions. Consider a tense open-plan office or a chaotic group chat where someone suddenly fumbles a routine task, and notice how the entire room instantly shifts focus to magnify that single error with strange, unspoken intensity. You might feel your fingers typing a slightly sharper response than necessary, your chest tightening with an unprompted wave of irritation as you join the silent chorus of disapproval. This physical tightening is the somatic marker of an internal crisis being redirected. The exhaustion you feel from maintaining your own flawless public facade is momentarily relieved by throwing fuel onto another person's fire. Through this behavioral pattern, the weight of your own unresolved anxiety is transferred to the designated target. In the vocabulary of Jungian depth psychology, this represents the mechanics of collective projection, a defensive maneuver where the collective unconscious expels its intolerable qualities by fixing them onto an external object. When this occurs, the group avoids the grueling work of genuine individuation, choosing instead the temporary relief of a shared illusion. The target becomes a magnet for every hidden vice, every unspoken vulnerability, and every suppressed failure that the crowd is too terrified to face within themselves. This creates a profound psychological paradox that challenges our fundamental understanding of human behavior. The crowd believes they are actively eradicating dysfunction by punishing the chosen target, yet they are actually dependent on that target to maintain their own psychological equilibrium. Without the container to hold their darkness, the collective architecture would collapse under its own weight. This raises a destabilizing question about the nature of social harmony and personal identity. If our social cohesion requires the systematic destruction of an engineered target, then the peace we experience in the group is never truly real. We are left caught in a web of shifting perceptions, where the line between the righteous observer and the dysfunctional crowd begins to blur entirely. While the collective temporarily stabilizes itself through this expulsion, the structural pressure within the objective psyche never truly disappears. This leaves us to wonder what happens when the engineered target is completely consumed, forcing the crowd to find a new vessel for the shadows they refuse to carry. The true unsettling reality is that the crowd does not actually want the target to change, cure their dysfunction, or disappear from the social landscape. If the engineered target were to suddenly transform into a model of perfect behavioral compliance, the collective would not celebrate. They would experience a profound, unnameable panic. This reveals a deep paradox within human groups. The person labeled as the source of all friction is precisely the structural linchpin keeping the entire community from tearing itself apart. The group requires a constant focal point for their shared distress, meaning the hunted individual is secretly the most valuable asset the collective possesses. We do not cast out the broken to destroy them. We preserve them so we do not have to fix ourselves. When you observe a group relentlessly critiquing a single colleague or public figure, you are not witnessing a moral cleanup crew, but an act of desperate psychological survival. The intensity of the persecution is always directly proportional to the amount of hidden rot the crowd is trying to ignore within its own borders. This dynamic operates entirely in the dark, driven by an unspoken, unconscious agreement that coordinates the actions of dozens of individuals without a single word ever being explicitly spoken. No one plans the trap, yet everyone knows exactly when to pull the trigger. This leaves us facing a deeply volatile layer of uncertainty regarding our own personal autonomy within any everyday group setting. If the collective mind can seamlessly organize such a complex sacrificial mechanism without our conscious consent or intentional alignment, we must question who is actually directing our social choices, our sudden slights, and our bursts of righteous indignation. We like to believe we are independent actors making rational moral judgments, but the reality suggests we are often merely instruments of a larger, unseeable psychic force that demands submission. The selection of the target is never a random accident. It is always guided by a precise, silent assessment of vulnerability and resonance executed by the objective psyche. But if this selection happens entirely beneath our conscious awareness, then we must confront the most dangerous implication of all. The group structure protects itself by assigning guilt to the few, which forces us to ask, what happens when the collective I finishes consuming the current scapegoat, turns its gaze inward, and quietly begins auditing the intricate details of your private life to determine if you should become the next necessary vessel for its darkness? To understand how a group can unconsciously collaborate to engineer a target, we must first look at how the individual alone, unconscious, quietly governs your own private choices. When you wake up with a sudden, unexplainable sense of dread, or find yourself intensely repulsed by a stranger's minor habit, you rarely assume these reactions are dictated by a hidden force. Instead, the ego immediately invents a logical narrative to justify the feeling, convincing you that your irritation is entirely rational. This everyday self-deception suggests that our conscious awareness is not the absolute master of our psychological house. Beneath the surface of daily routines, the objective psyche operates as a living, breathing landscape that continuously shapes what we see, what we fear, and how we define our very identity outside our active awareness. As these hidden currents accumulate over a lifetime, they form rigid behavioral patterns that dictate our relationships, our career directions, and our emotional limits. When certain aspects of the self, such as natural aggression, deep-seated envy, or intense vulnerability, are deemed unacceptable by our conscious values, they do not simply dissolve. They are pushed into the deep recesses of the shadow, where they remain highly active and charged with emotional energy. The unconscious appears to function as a self-regulating organism, always seeking balance. When the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge its own darkness, the inner psyche compensates by altering our external perception. You begin to notice those exact denied traits in the people around you, reacting with intense, unprompted hostility to the very flaws you carry in secret. This complex psychological dynamic fundamentally reframes what we call personal reality. If our dislikes, our anxieties, and our sudden impulses are being orchestrated by an unseeable internal depth, then the sovereign individual begins to look like a comforting myth. We are not merely passive observers of the world. Our unexamined inner conflicts are actively projecting themselves onto our surroundings, transforming our daily lives into a mirror of our hidden vulnerabilities. This permeability of identity means that your private psychological state is never truly isolated from the collective field. Your unexpressed pain and buried stress are constantly radiating outward, subtly influencing how you interact with friends, family, and strangers. This realization carries a heavy, unanswered implication that destabilizes our sense of safety. If our deepest personal choices are being continually guided by a hidden psychological undercurrent we cannot directly see, we are forced to wonder how much of our life story truly belongs to us. Our conscious interaction with the world rests on a profound misunderstanding of how human perception actually functions. We assume that our eyes and minds operate like impartial cameras, recording an objective reality that exists independently of our internal states. In truth, the mind functions as an active generator of experience, filtering and bending external data to satisfy the deep, unspoken demands of the unconscious. When a community faces an internal crisis of meaning or an accumulation of unacknowledged anxiety, it does not look at the situation objectively. Instead, the collective psyche alters its entire model of reality, distorting the perception of facts to protect the group from its own inner decay. This psychological dynamic provides a deeper look into why the crowd depends so heavily on the chosen target to maintain its equilibrium. The collective does not attack the target because they genuinely desire to eradicate dysfunction. They maintain the target because they require an external container to validate their own fragile sense of order. By focusing all ambient hostility onto a single person, the group successfully warps its own perceptual field, creating a shared illusion where all defect resides in the outsider and all purity remains within the collective. The target becomes a structural necessity for the group's reality model, functioning as the negative pole that allows the crowd to experience themselves as positive, aligned, and entirely blameless. We cling to this distorted view because it spares us the agonizing discomfort of self-examination. This systematic distortion transforms the social environment into a closed loop of self-reinforcing projections. When a group reaches consensus regarding an individual's guilt, that agreement alters the very physics of how information is processed within the community. Valid evidence that might exonerate the target is automatically minimized, ignored, or reframed as a deceptive maneuver, because admitting the target's innocence would collapse the collective defense mechanism and force the crowd to face its own internal rot. The engineered target is consequently trapped within a reality model manufactured entirely by the unconscious needs of others, where every movement they make is immediately interpreted as proof of their inherent flaws. We deceive ourselves into believing that our judgments are based on objective facts, yet this blindness ensures that the scapegoat remains essential to our daily survival. The social peace we experience is never a reflection of genuine psychological health, but a curated blindness that we collectively sustain. Yet the ultimate betrayal is that the very shield you use to look at their failure is quietly carving a matching wound into your own character. When you sit in a meeting and intentionally avoid eye contact with a struggling presenter, your physical withdrawal represents the initial phase of this collective avoidance. This somatic aversion is not an accidental gesture. It is a calculated retreat of the ego to protect itself from absorbing the discomfort of another's vulnerability. In the mechanics of perception physics, information is not merely received, it is actively distributed through the nonverbal cues of everyone present in the room. A slight nod of agreement or a subtle sigh of impatience acts as a tiny energy signal that coordinates the group's emotional alignment without any spoken instruction. This unspoken coordination implies that our daily interactions are governed by a hidden field of psychological information, where the crowd reads the room to find where the tension can be safely discharged. Consider how quickly you adopt a sharper tone when discussing a specific person with your peers during a casual coffee break. That vocal shift is the behavioral signature of an internal alignment, where your private shadow seeks validation by blending into the collective disapproval. By adopting the group's posture, you escape the burden of your own unexpressed frustrations and transfer them onto the designated outsider. This operational habit operates seamlessly across all areas of life, from family dynamics to digital platforms, turning ordinary behaviors into instruments of projection. Ironically, the more fiercely we punish the target's flaws, the more deeply we embed those exact unacknowledged traits into our own operational habits. Watch the way someone clears their throat or shifts their weight when an uncomfortable truth is mentioned in a social gathering. These subtle micro-movements are physiological compensations, the physical body's attempt to release the inner pressure of a truth that the conscious mind refuses to articulate. When these individual physical reactions sync up across a room, the group creates an invisible wall of resistance that locks the target into their sacrificial role. This alignment creates a highly stable social architecture that temporarily insulates every member from the painful process of genuine psychological individuation. The ultimate paradox of this mechanism is that the collective achieves its superficial unity only by remaining fundamentally fractured on an individual level. This entire process is not a detached sociological theory. It is the silent architecture of your own daily compromises and hidden stresses. When you look closely at the targets you have helped create, you are actually staring directly into the mirror of your own disowned self. The moment you surrender your private judgment to the collective consensus, a quiet, catastrophic transaction occurs within your own psyche. You trade the agonizing burden of personal responsibility for the intoxicating warmth of group alignment. This trade-off requires a steep price, the systematic numbing of your moral intuition. To maintain the illusion of the scapegoat's absolute guilt, you must actively suppress the small, hesitant voice within that whispers warnings of injustice. Over time, this repetitive suppression causes a profound atrophy of the conscious ego, mutating your personality from an independent, self-reflecting entity into a passive conduit for collective impulses. This psychological erosion explains why otherwise gentle, rational individuals can transform into ruthless participants in a social execution. They are no longer acting as individuals. They have temporarily slipped into a state of collective regression, where the moral constraints of the civilized self are dissolved into the primitive physics of the crowd. In this state, the individual experiences a false sense of liberation, a pseudo-enlightenment, because the inner tension between their conscious ideals and their hidden shadow has been artificially resolved by directing all negativity outward. But this relief is a psychological counterfeit. The energy you expend hunting the outsider is energy stolen directly from your own development, locking you into a state of permanent psychological arrest. The tragedy of the collective participant is that they become a ghost in their own biography, executing a script written by an invisible director. When you look at the social landscape through this lens, the true cost of group compliance becomes terrifyingly clear. By participating in the engineering of a target, you are not merely damaging an outsider, you are actively dismantling your own capacity for individuation. You become dependent on the group's shared hatred to feel a sense of internal cohesion. If the target vanishes, your artificial peace vanishes with them, leaving you completely exposed to the raw, unmediated contents of your own unconscious. We protect the mechanism of the scapegoat because we are terrified of the silence that follows the hunt, the heavy, suffocating silence, where we are finally forced to sit alone in a room with our own unintegrated darkness. Breaking free from this collective spell demands an act of psychological treason against the group. It requires the individual to deliberately withdraw their projections from the external target and turn their gaze entirely inward. This withdrawal is a deeply destabilizing process, akin to a controlled psychological collapse. When you stop blaming the outsider for the ambient tension in your life, the entire weight of that unresolved anxiety falls squarely back onto your own shoulders. The comforting illusion of your own purity dissolves, forcing you to confront the unsettling reality that the cruelty, envy, and chaos you despised in the target are living structures within your own objective psyche. This confrontation is the threshold of true shadow integration. It is the moment you realize that the engineered target was never an enemy to be destroyed, but a mirror reflecting the unlived, unacknowledged portions of your own soul. To look into this mirror without flinching is to accept the absolute loneliness of individual consciousness. You must stand completely isolated, refusing to join the collective chant, even as the crowd turns its eyes toward you, sensing your non-compliance. The group perceives your withdrawal not as an act of moral clarity, but as a dangerous betrayal of their shared defense mechanism, making you the next natural candidate for the sacrificial altar. The ultimate paradox of the scapegoat mechanism is that the only way to save the collective from its own self-destructive loop is for the individual to refuse to participate in it. True social healing does not occur through mass movements or public trials. It happens in the absolute privacy of a single mind willing to bear its own darkness. When you consciously choose to contain your own psychological poison, rather than projecting it onto a convenient target, you disrupt the invisible architecture of the crowd. You become a point of stability in a sea of collective hysteria. It is a lonely, dangerous, and deeply exhausting path, but it is the only road that leads away from the primitive physics of the hunt and toward the genuine realization of a sovereign, integrated human being. Achieving this state of inner containment grants the individual a rare and destabilizing attribute: true psychic immunity. This immunity is not a defensive armor or an arrogant intellectual detachment. Rather, it is a profound psychological transparency. The collective relies on specific emotional hooks: your unacknowledged guilt, your secret vanity, or your terror of social exile, to drag you into the sacrificial mechanism. When you map and integrate your own shadow, those hooks find no purchase. The crowd's manipulative narratives and sudden bursts of righteous outrage simply pass through you, failing to ignite the expected behavioral response. By refusing to absorb or reflect the group's ambient panic, you become an anomaly in the social physics of the environment. The crowd instinctively senses this transparency and finds it deeply unnerving. To an unconscious group, an individual who cannot be manipulated by shame or the promise of belonging is an unpredictable element, a walking void in their matrix of projection. You are no longer readable to the collective mind because you no longer share their collective illusions. Consequently, the group may attempt one final desperate strategy. They will try to force you into the role of the target simply because your clarity exposes their hidden dysfunction. The ultimate test of individual sovereignty is not surviving the crowd's hatred, but outlasting their desperate need for your compliance. Navigating the world with this level of consciousness requires a permanent acceptance of the periphery. You must accept that you can never fully merge with the unreflective warmth of ordinary group dynamics again. The price of your psychological independence is a persistent, clean loneliness. You walk through offices, social gatherings, and digital spaces as an observant witness to the cyclical madness of the human collective, seeing the traps before they're sprung and the scapegoats before they are chosen. Yet this isolation is not barren. It is the fertile soil of the transcendent function, the psychological space where a genuinely original life story can finally be written, entirely free from the unseeable tyranny of the crowd.